Pleased to be joined by the former Assistant General Manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Mr. Bill Waters. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Michael. Nice to talk to you again.
Always a pleasure, and we've got a lot to look forward to with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, we haven't talked since, I believe, around the draft, and this is the first time we have spoken since the Leafs landed the big fish in free agency. They tried with Steven Stamkos. They went down the road of the Toronto boy coming home. They did it with David Clarkson, and that was a dismal failure for a number of reasons, but they did land the big fish with John Tavares, signing a 7-year, $77 million contract. First of all, Bill, what do you think of that signing and what it portends for the future of the Maple Leafs?
Well, we've had a glimpse of John in the preseason, but it's the ability as a management group and as a franchise to get a player of that caliber with no compensation. It's a very significant step forward for the franchise in its trek to get to Stanley Cup land, and the first step, of course, is to win one round in the playoffs, and I've always accentuated that. I don't like to see people getting ahead of themselves, and when you have the Leafs as the favorite in the Stanley Cup Derby, they're getting ahead of themselves. I mean, I dare say, Mike, that in their own division, they would probably be rated third behind Boston and Tampa Bay. So it's not going to be easy, but getting Tavares is a significant step forward, and it's a credit to all of them. I'm happy for John Tavares because he got to come home and play in the best hockey city in the world, and to his credit, he took a bit of a haircut in order to do it, and it all makes sense. Now the Leafs have taken a giant step forward since they lost to the Bruins in the playoffs. But let's not lose sight of the fact that they lost, and they've got to start winning. And this appears to be the year that they got to do it.
I mean, I've been trying not to be the skunk at the garden party when it comes to my column on Hockey Buzz and my writing for the Sporting News when I talk about the Leafs and saying, realistically, they could lose in the first round again. I mean, there's a lot of excitement. Tavares is a premier talent. And the 1-2 punch with him and Austin Matthews is going to be tough for other teams to contain. But my assertion has been this team needs to get better on the blue line for them ever to get out of the first round and maybe get to the conference final or the Stanley Cup final. And that's the one area that Kyle Dubas didn't address. And I know that him and Babcock during training camp have said, we're believers in our defense. Well, I think like halfway through the season, if they play the way that they've played over the last couple of years, they're going to be looking for a defenseman before the trade deadline.
Well, I don't think there's any question. They have not improved their defense, whether they have gotten Augello from Russia, and he's a player who's 26 years old, has played for a long time in the KHL, should be able to comfortably fit into the sixth spot, maybe even go higher. But they still don't have a tough defenseman. And Travis Dermott is a kid on the rise, and he should be able to fill in the 5 spot. So they've filled in on defense, but they've done nothing to enhance their defense. Fortunately, Nikita Zaitsev could be healthy all year. He was not very good last year, and he has to play the way he played the year before with Jake Gardiner in order to compensate for Jake Gardner's unfortunate misgivings. And if they don't do that, then they're in real trouble as far as advancing in the playoffs. If they get a big year from Augello and they get a big year from Zaitsev, and the rest play according to the way that their expectations fall, then they could be all right. But you need defensemen that'll go into the corner and make it tough on those guys, and mostly skilled guys, to get the puck in front or to get to the front. And the Leafs have not had a propensity for doing that ever since Babcock got here, and God only knows they didn't have it before. So it's no surprise to me as to what has to be done, and you've summed it up, and I think all people who follow the Leafs closely know that. Their goaltending is in the top 10. Their forwards, with particularly center ice, probably the best center ice in the league. And their defense is, I don't know where you'd rate it, but it's not in the top 10. So it's going to be something that they know better than anybody they have to address, whether it's early in the season in a big trade. We've talked about the possibility of Trouba moving for Nylander. That's a deal that I would try to make if I had any input into what they do. I don't, but I used to, so that's why I use that privilege. But having said all that, you've still got a team that's going to compete in the top three in their division, and as such, if they don't get in the number one hole, they're going to play either the Bruins or the Lightning in the first round. And I don't think there's too many people that'll sit here and tell you that they can beat the Bruins or the Lightning in the first round, and I don't think they're too far wrong. So the Leafs have to strengthen their defense between now and the trade deadline.
The one area of concern, I think you analyzed it very well, but the one area of concern I have with their defense is Ron Hainsey, and I'm careful not to misinterpret how a player plays in the exhibition season, especially when it's somebody who's 36 or 37 years old, because they're not operating at 100%. But at the end of last year, because Hainsey was so, I think, overused as a penalty killer and as a top pairing defenseman, he wasn't the same guy in the latter half of the year and in the playoffs that he was at the beginning of the year. And if he slips, then either Ozhiganov or even Dermott may have to move up into a top four role before they can go out and get themselves a defenseman at the deadline. That's where I fear there might be a problem, because Hainsey is a little long in the tooth.
Well, I don't think we should look past the other component of the team, and that's the coaching. Mike's bench management has to improve. He has to allow Anderson more rest time. He has to allow Hainsey more rest time. And he's going to have to put up with whatever predicament that creates. And you know me, I have a lot of confidence in Mike Babcock as a coach. So I know that he has reviewed that in his own mind. His evaluation and self-examination at the end of last year would have said that he did not manage Hainsey or Anderson very well. And that's something that he has to improve. So I'm counting on that improving. In other words, Hainsey doesn't kill penalties for 2 full minutes. Maybe he can, but he's out of gas by about the 65-game mark. And he's never played that much in his life. I think he's been a strong addition to the team, but properly managed behind the bench has to be a part of that consideration. And I know that Babcock will include that in his plan to improve himself as a coach, and in addition to that, of course, give Anderson more rest.
Going off of that, because there are two areas that I think have raised the eyebrows of observers. One we'll deal with, because you were talking about the goaltending, is the battle between Curtis McElhinney and Garrett Sparks. Now, Garrett Sparks was AHL Goaltender of the Year, had a phenomenal season, won a Calder Cup with the Marlies. But there is some question, and I asked him a question regarding adjusting to the role of an NHL backup at the beginning of training camp, and he essentially said, I don't think there is an adjustment, which I think is wrong, because I think you have to sort of adjust your mentality to be more of a support player and also be ready at a moment's notice, as opposed to somebody who's a starter who's playing 50 or 60 games. McElhinney had a phenomenal year last year. A goals against of I think 2.15 and a save percentage over .930, and he's been the better of the two goaltenders. But the problem is that Sparks and McElhinney are both they have to both clear waivers, and Kyle Dubas has indicated he is not going to carry 3 goaltenders. So right now, if it was up to Babcock, I think the choice would be McElhinney. If it was up to Dubas, I think the choice would be Sparks. I don't know if there's going to be any friction here, but if this is truly a contending team, Bill, I think McElhinney is the guy they have to go with, but I don't know whether they're going to or not. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm having a hard time finding any thought as to why McElhinney should be replaced. He played his position as well, as you just outlined, statistically, as any player on the team. As a backup goaltender, he was superb. There's no reason to change him. If Sparks is so good that other teams want him, well, you better either try and put him on waivers. I don't think there's any secret to that. You're going to unnecessarily, in the short term at least, weaken your team by taking out a guy who has played as well as McElhinney. And as I've noticed, players on that team play well for him and I think enjoy playing with him. That's an important factor. There's nothing wrong with Garrett Sparks. He just has to find a team that has a position available as a backup with a chance to get 30 games. Get himself in and just find out whether he can be a number one guy. I've watched him play twice this offseason, and he hasn't played anywhere close to being a first-string NHL goaltender. And that's unfair criticism, but that's a fact. And there's no sense of pretending what you are. You are what you are. You're the third goaltender in the system. And if they warp that, if they try to change that in order to develop Sparks, they're going to be in a little bit of trouble, certainly on the short term. I am not a long-term Sparks guy, and I don't say that disrespectfully. I just say at the age of 25, 26, you got a pretty good idea of what this goaltender is going to be for you. And if he's fighting to be a backup, keep the guy that's done the job.
I spoke to an NHL scout last weekend, and he basically said there are enough teams out there that are looking to upgrade as a backup goaltender that if Sparks was put on waivers, that he'd probably be claimed. But I would use the same case when it comes to McElhinney. I can just look at the rosters and situations around the NHL, like Tampa Bay with Louis Domingue as their backup, and Winnipeg with Laurent Boisseau as their backup. If McElhinney is out there, and Philadelphia has two goaltenders injured right now, if McElhinney's out there, he's going to get claimed. So I think they're going to lose one of the two goaltenders either by trade or by waivers. And again, I say if they're truly a contender, they should want the best backup in terms of performance for this year, and to me, that's McElhinney.
I don't think you require a decision of the board to come to that decision. I think that McElhinney has earned the right. He's a 2-year contract. This is his second year. And based on how he played last year, he certainly has earned the right to have his job back. And Babcock's not going to take his job away from him based on an American League performance, which was a solid one. But we can find a lot of those that don't translate into NHL success. And I'm not suggesting that Sparks won't become an NHL goaltender, but he is not the best goaltender for the goaltending job that's available in Toronto.
The other peculiarity is the first power play, which they've sort of put together this week. And there's been some speculation that one of the things between Austin Matthews and Babcock, there was supposedly some friction at the end of the year, was the fact that he was on the second power play rather than on the top power play. And if you look at the statistics last year, the Leafs' top power play last year was second in the NHL. So I think you can justify Babcock's position of not, messing with something that's working. But now, with Bozak and Van Riemsdyk gone, now John Tavares moves into the JVR spot as sort of the net front presence, and Austin Matthews takes Bozak's spot. But the peculiarity is here you have all three top centers, Kadri, Matthews, Tavares, on the number one power play. And when questioned about this, Babcock sort of bristled about the assertion that he was loading up the first power play. But if you look at it, he is loading up the first power play. And the second power play unit, even with Nylander back, is going to be much less potent offensively. So do you think this is something that could last a while, or do you sort of go with what a lot of people are saying, this is like sort of a trial balloon, and maybe a few games into the season they switch back or switch around the power play unit?
Well, he's always got the flexibility to do that. I think Kadri should be on the ice as much as you can get him on the ice. He's the only forward they have that has that little bite to him, and it can be a nasty bite, but it has to be a part of that team, whether it's on the power play or whether it's killing penalties. And he does both. To me, he's their most valuable centerman at this stage. Now, you've got John Tavares, who could prove otherwise, and you've got a young Austin Matthews, who probably will. But the guy that I want on the ice when the Leafs need help, or when they need a goal, is Nazem Kadri, because he plays the game in a fashion that doesn't preclude grit being a part of it. You can get in a lot of trouble if you play too much skill. You got to have guys that'll go and get the puck. You got to have guys that'll go and knock people over to get the puck. And if they don't, the power play will become a rotating pinball. It just they'll have no direction, and they'll lose the puck and won't be able to get it. And that's what they need. They need somebody that can show the determination. And for me, Kadri is on the top of the list on the Leaf team. So I'm not complaining about Kadri being on the power play. If you pay Tavares $11 million, he's got to be on the power play. Your best player is Austin Matthews, according to most, and he's got to be on the power play. I don't think Mike Babcock has any choice but to put those three on the power play. And if he's concerned about his second power play, then he sprinkles in some of the skilled forwards, whether it be Nylander if he comes back, and or his replacement. Connor Brown is a skilled player. Those guys can play on the back end of the power play. So I'm not worried about the back end. I'm worried about the first 30 seconds when the chances come and they've got three of the best. Well, they got their three best centermen, the best centermen in the league. I don't think you could have a better power play than have those three on it.
Now, where I wanted to tap your knowledge as a former assistant general manager of the Maple Leafs who was responsible for negotiating contracts and also being a former player agent, is the situation with William Nylander, who's a restricted free agent, one of the two restricted free agents still unsigned in the league. It hasn't been an acrimonious negotiation between Louis Gross and Dubas, but I think the battle lines have been set for a while, and obviously I think the reason for that is because they have big contracts coming up next year with Marner, with Matthews, and with Jake Gardiner if they want to re-sign him, and they're trying to hold the line. And also, Kadri, Riley, and Tavares all took less to stay or come to Toronto. So that's where things are at right now, and both sides are saying they want a long-term deal. But it came out a couple weeks ago that Nylander was asking for Leon Draisaitl money, which was $8.5 million. And the Leafs were offering in the low sixes. Bill, I like Nylander as a player, but I'm in the boat of him being more of a complementary guy than a core guy. And in that instance, I'm more in favor of him being signed to a bridge deal, or if it's a long-term deal, to something that's reasonable. But I don't think there's reasonable here in the Nylander camp. What's your read on the situation?
My read on Nylander is the same as it was last year when I was commenting on post-game shows on TSN radio of the Leaf games. And I was disappointed in Nylander, but the more I reflected on it, the more I could see he is the apple does not fall far from the tree. He plays a lot like his dad did, highly skilled, questionable motivation, which is tough to lay on anybody, but sometimes that shows. And they move around a lot. Michael Nylander was with 6 different teams, I think. That's father of. I'm not suggesting that Williams the same way, but don't be surprised. And I think Louis Gross, if I'm not mistaken, represented his father. I find Louis Gross to be a very capable agent, a reasonable guy, but he's stubborn, and he gets his heels dug in, and that's what I'm afraid of he's doing now. He's going to have to back off the 6 or 7 year deal and go back to the 2-year bridge. And I think, quite frankly, in the situation where the Leafs already have a 7-year guy, they're going to have an 8-year guy in Matthews. They're going to have an 8-year guy in Marner. You can't get too many of these guys. And ask Stanley Cup Bowman if you need any outside advice. You cannot overpay in the modern salary cap era. You can't take it back. And if they get up there where they've got their first 5 players at $38 million, they're going to be in trouble. They'll be in trouble well before they win the second round of the playoffs. So that's a big concern of Dubas's, and it should be. So in summation, I think you get Nylander to a 2-year deal just to sign him, and you trade him as quickly as you can.
I see the benefits of them getting locked up to, say, a 6-year deal if they can get him locked up for Now Nikolai Ehlers with Winnipeg signed 7 years, $6 million per. Sean Monahan was 6.3. Pasternak was 6.66. All long-term deals, all players comparable age. So that's sort of the ballpark in terms of where, Nylander should fall. But that's, I think, where people took a double take was, asking for $8 million, and that I'm assuming would be on an 8-year deal. And I think that's completely out of the question. It's when you're buying unrestricted years, I know that the salary goes up, but I don't think the Leafs are capable of signing him to that, and then Marner is going to probably ask for more than that, and we know Matthews is probably going to be on the equal footing of Tavares. So you're right. It could be a Chicago Blackhawks scenario all over again if they do that.
And they've got more of them than the Blackhawks had. And, if you've got Tavares and you say Matthews is better than Tavares, well, he may be someday. I don't think he is today. But it wouldn't be long. I can see a future in Matthews as their best player, but I don't like people getting ahead of themselves on that one. Let him evolve into the best player. And if they have to pay him, they have to pay him. And I'm with you, Mike. I think that the $11 million is a benchmark that the best player or the proclaimed best player, Austin Matthews, is going to get. The rest of them are guys that are in development stages and need to be given time. If they're not given time, then they're going to be in trouble. And I just don't want the team to ruin what they have by overpaying.
I think Kyle Dubas's biggest challenge is to sort of fit everybody underneath the umbrella, and I think that's going to be really tough. I know that he came out, one of the first things he said as general managers, we'll get them all signed, but he didn't say we're going to get them all signed to long-term deals. He didn't say we're going to get them all signed and they're all going to be here for 8 years. He says we're going to get them all signed. So I think they may get Nylander signed for 6 years.
You draw the conclusion, and it was something that Kyle probably wishes he hadn't said so emphatically, because getting them all signed makes the Leaf fandom think they'll be signed not relatively easily, but they'll be signed, not necessarily. If it's just it comes to a point where a player says, "Hey, if I'm not going to fit in the top 3 guys on this team, or 2 guys, then why bother? Just play it out. Become a free agent, take my chances, pick another team." The Leafs aren't the only team. They're the team of these young guys at this point. But if the Leafs can't afford them, and it's not that the Leafs can't afford them, the cap won't allow them to afford them. So that's one of the rules of the game, and you have to play within that. And that's I think Louis Gross is hanging his hat on the Draisaitl contract, which was extraordinarily poorly negotiated and poorly planned, and they're paying a big price for that, Edmonton, and so is the league. Draisaitl is overpaid by $2 million, very simply. And Kyle Dubas does not want to be the second guy. Let them all stay in Edmonton. It was bad judgment and a bad signing, and it was bad for the league, and it's bad for the future of a lot of players staying in a certain spot, particularly if their agent feels that he can pair up with Draisaitl on performance and get the same amount. Well, he's not in Edmonton, and he doesn't have a player that's making $12.5 and selling tickets. These guys, if they expect to get that type of money, like Connor McDavid does, they have to sell tickets. They have to have people come to watch them play. And I can assure you, none of the players that you've mentioned have been able to do that in Toronto yet.
It's going to be a situation next summer where, with Matthews, I have a feeling that Dubas will learn from the Edmonton experience and not sign Matthews before he signs Marner, because then Marner is going to be in the position of Draisaitl saying, well, I'm not $6 million less than Connor McDavid. I should be paid $8.
Yeah,
I think they'll get Marner done first. I think that's the way they're going to go. But
well, that's the smart way to do it. I can
that.
remember when Bobby Orr was playing and Don Orey was his partner. Don justifiably said, "Well, I don't think I'm $400,000 less than Bobby." But that's not how you negotiate a contract. You negotiate a contract based on what value you have to your team, not what value you have in comparison to your best player, that player who may or may not be a player who attracts people to games. And Orr, of course, was one of those. So was McDavid. And the other guys, in Don Orrey's case, he knew he wasn't, but he's using the same philosophy that Louis Gross is using on Nylander. Nylander thinks that he's as good as Draisaitl, and guess what? He very well may be right, but he ain't going to get the money, not in Toronto. And that's what you have to get into your head. Here's the Toronto pay scale. I remember Jim Gregory when he traded Rick Kehoe to Pittsburgh, who became a 50-goal scorer for a number of years. He wanted too much money. He wanted nearly the money that McDonald and Sittler were getting, $150,000 a year. That's a long time ago. But that's what a general manager has to do. If he doesn't want to fit into the plan, you have to, unfortunately, find the best deal you can for him and get him out.
Bill, thank you very much for coming on as well. We're going to definitely have you on during the season, checking back in to get your input on the Leafs and how they're playing. I think it's going to be a very entertaining year for Leaf fans. But like I said, I think that there's going to be still some improvement needed in key areas for this team to finally win that Stanley Cup. But we'll definitely check back with you, and we really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I think we have to make note of what we've gleaned from this. There has to be improvement in the coach's bench management. There has to be improvement on that defense. And there has to be some toughness shown on their forward lines. That's all they need to have a chance to win the first round when Tampa finishes first and Boston is playing Toronto in the first round. You don't want to get too excited about going to the Stanley Cup till you win the first round. And that's not a reflection on anything other than reality. The Leafs have got a great chance of advancing and doing well. There's no question of that. I just find it difficult to accept them as the top team in pursuit of the Stanley Cup. That's too far down the road for me, but they're going to be an entertaining team, and I'm with you. We're going to have a lot of fun watching them.
For Bill Waters, I'm Michael Augello. Thank you for listening.